All right, so everybody should have, just to make sure you've got stuff, everybody should have this. Okay, this is an outline of tonight's passage. We're gonna cover tonight what's known as the seven seals. So there are three groups of these major sevens in the book of Revelation. First, you have the seven seals, and then you have the seven trumpets, and then we're going to have what are called sometimes the seven bowls, sometimes they're called the seven plagues. So you have these three series of seven types of judgments or things that are revealed that John sees in his heavenly vision. And so tonight we're going to cover the first set of those, and it's really chapters 6 and 7, but we get into chapter 8 because the seventh seal, the last of these seals, is there in chapter 8, verse 1. But if you guys will remember, so last week we were in chapter 5, where we saw Jesus as the one who was worthy to open the scroll that was sealed with seven seals, right? So now in chapter 6, and chapter 7 really is a diversion to something else. Chapter 6, chapter 8, verse 1, we're going to see these seven seals. What is revealed as he breaks each or opens each of the seals. Now, what Susan is giving out to you, though, is my outline of the whole book of Revelation. And the reason that I wanted you to have that tonight, I've given it to you before, but this one is a little bit more detailed, is I want you to see how this vision of the seven seals fits into the overall letter. Sure. And we'll have it not with as much detail, but I'll put some of it on the screen. Before we do that, here's the main point of the seven seals. That Christ he makes use of evil forces to inflict punishment upon the world. So that's the first four seals. And he will one day respond to his people's pleas, that's the fifth seal, by judging the wicked, that's the sixth seal, and he will bring peace by destroying all those who oppose him and his people, that's the seventh seal. All right, so that's the main point, a summary of what these seals are about. We're seeing Jesus inflict punishment on the world. We see his people cry out for relief and help, and him respond in judgment by destroying those who oppose him. So that's the main point. But when we think about how this fits into the book of Revelation, that's really important for us to see. And so this outline that I gave you is, I think, going to be helpful. I want to talk about the structure of Revelation a little bit, all right? So one of the things you'll notice on your outline are these outer brackets over here. They're in blue, okay? And what I want you to see is that the first section of the book of Revelation, which we've already covered, that deals with the messages to the seven churches and some introductory material in chapter 1, that first section, it is matched up with the last section of the book, which focuses on the new heavens and new earth. In that the first section focuses upon the life of God's people in this age, whereas the last section is going to focus on the life of God's people in the age to come, the new heavens and new earth. And then there's also a correspondence between what we've covered the last 2 weeks, where John has this vision of the throne room and the Lamb who is victorious, the conquering Lamb, right? Well, down here in chapter 20, we have the opposite. We have the defeat of the dragon. The dragon being the chief opponent of the Lamb and of his people throughout the book of Revelation. And so these are the outer edges of the book of Revelation. And we're now getting into the interior of the book of Revelation, where it is very easy to become confused and get lost a little bit. So it might be helpful if we just sort of remember where we are each week as we work our way through the interior of the book of Revelation. So here we are tonight. We have the seven seals. Again, it is part of 3 sequences of sevens. And if you look on your more detailed outline, you'll notice that for each of these sequences of sevens, there's a bracketed section, an orange bracketed section. Can you see that? So what you get, for instance, in tonight's passage, you get 6 seals, and then where did the 7th one go? Oh no, you have to wait a whole chapter, and it's covered in just chapter 8, verse 1. So that in chapter 7, you get sort of a break or a parenthesis in the midst of the 7 seals. And we see that with each of these groups of sevens. There's kind of a break between the 6th item and the 7th item every time. That's really important to help us see that there's balancing going on here. And so tonight we're in the 7 seals, but then we're going to get the 7 trumpets. But here's something very interesting. Before we get to the last of these series of 3s, we have a much bigger sort of bracket or parenthesis, where we have in chapters 12 through 14 this story about the dragon, the beasts, and the lamb. Those are the primary figures in that section. And this is the middle of the book, or the center of the book. So in a lot of ways, particularly chapter 12, which really and truly is the center of the book. Chapter 12, where the dragon is pursuing the woman and her child, chapter 12 really is the center of the book of Revelation. If you're looking for where's the main idea, you go to chapter 12. But chapter 12 is part of this whole section, 12 through 14. And then you finally get your last series of sevens. So it's almost like John sets us up. He says, I'm going to give you 7 of something, but before you get the last item, he's going to take a break. Well, we're going to get 3 series of sevens, but before we get to the last series of sevens, we got to take a break. And the vision shifts to somewhere else, and you see something else. That's what's happening here. And then you get, in chapters 18 and 19, the judgment of the dragon's allies. We'll get to who all these figures are eventually, okay? And that comes before the final, ultimate defeat of the dragon in chapter 20. So if you look on here, you can see it on here as well, but you can really see just how highly structured the book of Revelation is. Sometimes when we think, oh, John is writing down the visions that he sees, we think of him as scribbling it down really fast as he's seeing it, and maybe that's why it's confusing. Well, no, not at all. John has had real visions and he has seen things, but then he has written down his visions in a really organized and artistic fashion. And recognizing that will help us to better understand what's happening in the book of Revelation. All right? One of the things that we also see in these 3 groups of 7, not only do you always have 6 of them, a break, and then the last one, but in all 3 of them, the first 4 are sort of grouped together and very closely related. Well, that's going to happen tonight. Because the first 4 of the 7 seals are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I'm sure you've heard of maybe before. Maybe you've heard of it in movies or TV shows. It sounds really ominous. And so tonight we're going to find out who are these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? What is that really about? But you've got to see it as a part of this whole in this structure. So before we jump into chapter 6, and we're not going to really deal with chapter 7 tonight, but chapter 6 and the first verse of chapter 8, let me see if you guys, I just want to pause and give you a chance to ask questions about the overall structure and themes of Revelation. You need another one? Okay. I'll put all the extras over here, just in case. Okay. All right, so, Job.
It's an actual dragon?
No, it's Satan. The dragon is Satan. And we're told that explicitly in the book of Revelation. We don't have to figure that out. John talks about the dragon, and then he says, who is the devil and Satan? So we know that for sure. It's a good question. Any other questions about the big picture things here? Cool.
Does other apocalyptic literature have a similar pattern? Like, because it seems like it mirrors. It's like
It almost is. And some scholars will try to make it mirror perfectly. I feel like you have to twist things a little bit to get it to do that. But I do think the first two and the last two sections are kind of mirroring each other. And I do think here in the middle, we have this 12 through 14 as the center of the book on purpose. But it's intentional. We see some of that, yes, in other apocalyptic literature. What we really see, not just in apocalyptic literature, but generally in biblical writings, particularly the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament, we will often see this kind of parallelism, where you have parallel sections or parallel lines, and sometimes they'll work like a sandwich like this. So that if you read some of the Psalms, you might notice that either in a particular stanza of the Psalm, section of it, or maybe in the whole Psalm, you'll note that sometimes they say the same thing in the first verse as they say in the last verse. And they almost are bookends or, sandwiching everything in the middle. Sometimes it's more complicated than that, and you get this balancing all the way through. We don't quite have that here, but sometimes you do get that. And when you get that kind of where you have matching all the way, so not only do these match, but if, for instance, the 7 seals lined up with the judgment of the dragon's allies, the 7 trumpets, if they lined up that neatly, where it's complete like that, scholars will call that a chiasm. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term. I'm not as convinced as others that we have those everywhere. I think they're there in the Bible, but some people seem to find them everywhere, and it seems a little bit imaginative to me. Chiasm? C-H-I-A-S-M. Now I regret saying it. C-H-I-A-S-M. S-M. I handed Wanda my notes earlier. No, I handed them to you. So we do see it in not just other apocalyptic literature. We do see some of this structural type of stuff, but we see it even just in the Old Testament.
Because it's just a literary structure.
Yeah, and we even see it in modern literature. I think sometimes this happens, particularly this sandwiching thing where you return to themes at the end. It happens, and it is intentional, but it's not as if the author is always thinking, I'm going to put the same thing at the end as at the beginning. But that's kind of a natural way of writing things. You want to come to the end and you want to sum things up. Here it seems a little bit more intentional because we're getting the opposite almost, right? People of God in this age, people of God in the next age. The victorious lamb, the defeated dragon. I think that's very intentional. But it's such a common literary device that sometimes it's not even on the forefront of the thinking of the author when you come back at the end to themes from the beginning. That sandwiching thing. It's just very common. Yeah.
I would think if you see that kind of literary structure, it shows it more being like, okay, we're taking this more of the meaning behind this, not necessarily absolutely literal, because like with literal stuff, we see like the law, it flows a certain way, and the letters, everything's a little bit different. But in this, you would think that more people would. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. I think most modern scholars reading the book of Revelation recognize all of this, and they avoid over-literalizing things. But on the popular level especially, there's a lot of kind of literalistic reading of the book of Revelation that takes place. And we do want to avoid that because it's John. There are a lot of literary devices and things that John uses throughout the book of Revelation. So again, he's not just feverishly writing down the visions as he sees them. He's artfully composing a book describing the visions that he saw. And that makes a big difference. It really does. Any other questions about kind of this kind of big picture stuff? Okay. So let's jump into these 7 seals then. Again, these are the seals on the scroll that only the Lamb is worthy to open the scroll and to make known its contents. All right, and that's really important because never in the midst of these seals, never is Jesus without his sovereign authority over the things that unfold. He's opening, he's breaking open the seals. He's making these things known. Probably one of the most helpful things that you can hear about this is that partly because of the way it's artfully composed, partly because of the way that each sequence of 7s that we get in many ways repeats things that we see in the earlier sequences. So when we get to, for instance, the trumpets, we'll see that a lot of the themes of the 7 seals are picked up and carried forward in the trumpets. So that what we're getting is not a sort of linear, chronological accounting of the last days. Right? John is not trying to give us a timeline by which we can sort of figure out exactly what's going to happen when in the last days. That's not what he's doing. In fact, when we look at these first 4 seals, these riders, the horsemen, I don't think that we're supposed to read this and say, okay, so this one comes first, and then after he's done doing his business on the earth, then there's a second guy that comes, and he does some things, and then the third. The things that these horsemen do, the events described in their actions, are things that are happening throughout the last days, which, by the way, is the church age, the entire church age. So the things that are happening in these first 4 seals are happening and unfolding at the same time, not one after the other. There is a little bit of a logical progression, but not chronological. They're happening kind of at the same time, different ways of describing God's punishment of the wicked throughout this age. And one of the ways that we can see that is if we read the descriptions of them, we'll notice that as we get down here to the last one, the last rider is really kind of doing all the same things that these others did. So let's take a look so that we can so you'll know what in the world I'm talking about. So we're going to look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. That's where we see the 4 horsemen, the first 4 seals. So John says, "Now I watched," or I saw. That's a word I mentioned last week that helps us to break up the book of Revelation into big and small pieces. "Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come.' And I looked," there's the word again, "and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer." So the first horseman has a bow with which to shoot people, and he comes out conquering and to conquer. Verse 3, "When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come.' And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword." So the second one has a sword and is able to create all of this chaos so that people come against one another. The third, verse 5, "When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in its hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine.'" Now that may sound really confusing to you, but it's indicative of a famine. A denarius in the ancient world is basically a day's wage for the average laborer. That's what it is, okay? So a a quart of wheat for an entire day's labor is not very much. You're not going to make much, and it's not going to satisfy a whole family. So he's pronouncing a judgment of famine is what he's doing. That's what all of this means. And then when you come to the fourth one, the last of the horsemen, like I said, he sort of sums up and almost, he repeats the things that the others do. Verse 7, when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. So notice, this last of the horsemen has the same. He has the sword, right? Like the one horseman. He brings famine, like the last one that we saw. So we're not seeing something entirely different and separate. Again, these four horsemen are not to be thought of as four chronological stages in the last days, but rather, these are an outpouring of God's judgment upon those who persecute his people or come against his people. But these are temporal judgments. This is not the final judgment. So what you've got to remember is that the book of Revelation is written to a people who are facing persecution presently, and then wider persecution in the near future. And so much of the book of Revelation is written to encourage us to endure. Well, one of the ways that we can be encouraged to endure is to know that even though sometimes to us it looks like God is ignoring all the evil in the world, the reality is he is continuing to call people to account even in this age. People don't always get away with all of the evil that they do. Sometimes they do, but God's not completely turned a blind eye. He permits these terrible things to happen, which come upon the wicked. They create trials for God's people, but they bring judgment upon the wicked. And so that's what's happening here. It's a very sort of apocalyptic description of God's permitting and allowing all sorts of bad things to come upon those who do bad things to his people. That's what we're seeing here. Sure. Yeah. Why are they numbered? All of this imagery is drawn mainly from the book of Zechariah. And they're numbered for the same reason that you have the seals numbered, right? The book of Revelation loves to do these numbers. Now, typically the number 4 represents the world or the earth. So it may very well be that we have 4 horsemen because these are all earthly judgments. Okay? They're all intertwined, but 4 ways of describing the judgment, or this temporal judgment, not the final judgment, but this judgment that comes on the world even now. That may be why there's 4. Because like I said, we see in the other groups of 7, the first 4 go together. And then you get 2 more, and then there's a break, and then you get the last one. Each time you get the same thing. In fact, if you want to see some of that Old Testament imagery, let's go to Zechariah chapter 1, and then we'll flip over to Zechariah chapter 8. Zechariah is toward the back of your Old Testament. Here we go. All right. So, Zechariah chapter 1, just to give you a sampling of it. Verse 7, on the 24th day of the 11th month, which is in the month of Shebat, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, son of Iddo, saying, I saw in the night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. So we have 4 here. A red one, and then a red, sorrel, and white one behind him. Then I said, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel who talked with me said to me, "I will show you what they are." So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, "These are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth." And they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, "We have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest." So you have these 4 horses that go out, 4 horses, 4 different colors. They don't match. John's not just copying over everything, right? But the similarity is not accidental. And so here they're sent out to patrol the world or the earth, the land. But in Revelation, they bring temporal judgments upon the world. And you can turn over to chapter 6. Very similar in chapter 6. Verse 1, he says, "Again I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled horses." So again, very similar to Revelation. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel answered and said to me, "These are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. The chariot with the black horses goes toward the north country, the white ones go after them, and the dappled ones go toward the south country. When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, 'Go, patrol the earth.' So they patrolled the earth. And then he cried out to me, 'Behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country.'" So in Zechariah, these 4 different colored horses, or here it's chariots with multiple horses, are sent out to patrol the earth or the world. You have mention of the 4 winds, right? Again, 4 typically in apocalyptic literature, and Zechariah is, and kind of a pre-apocalyptic or early apocalyptic literature, 4 tends to represent the world or this earth. You have the 4 winds, you have the 4 directions, right? And so it's not a surprise that you have 4. Why he arranges them in the order, I'm not sure, in the order in which he puts them. There is kind of a little bit of a building until you get to the last one, and the 4th one kind of does everything that the earlier ones did, but it's hard to say. Other questions over these 4 horsemen? Okay, so again, just to summarize, the 4 horsemen are judgments that come upon the world during this age where God is bringing some measure of justice to those who persecute his people. Now, the reason why I'm throwing in this "who persecute his people" is because when you get to the 5th seal, you read of the cries or the prayers of believers who have died for the faith. And they're asking, how much longer do we have to wait? So the first 4 seals are kind of almost like a pre-answer to that anticipated question. But the ultimate answer to that question, though, comes with the 6th and the 7th seals. Because in the 6th seal, we really see judgment begin to fall upon the kings of the earth and those who follow after them. But first, we need to read the 5th seal. So, back to Revelation. There are also some other sort of background. You can jot these down to take a look at later. Ezekiel 5, 16 and 17. And in Ezekiel 14, 21, we see there some language that is drawn upon by John, but we can't cover everything. All right, so back to Revelation, if I can get back there. To the 5th seal, which is found in verses 9 through 11. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. So these are martyrs, right? People who died for the faith. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Again, one of the reasons that we don't want to read these just as a chronological sequence is that if they're strictly chronological, then they're crying out and answering this question when we've just seen 4 different types of judgments upon the earth. So we shouldn't just read this, each seal chronologically after the other. Right? We're being told God is actively at work in the world, and he doesn't just let evil go unchecked. We've already been told that. Now we hear the voices of those, though, who've been martyred and who have suffered. And they want to know, how long? How long till we're vindicated? Now, the answer to that question is found in the 6th seal. So again, let's go down to verse 12. When he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? So the 6th seal is a picture of the final judgment. That's what we're getting. We're going to see in every series of 7s and in other places in Revelation, we're going to see different descriptions of the final judgment. Another reason why it's a mistake to read the book of Revelation just as a straight line chronological explanation of things that they're going to unfold in the last days. If that's the case, then you've got a lot of different judgments, a lot of final judgments. But that's not what we have. We have different descriptions of the same judgment in every section of the book of Revelation. And most of these descriptions of the final judgment are also drawing on a lot of Old Testament imagery. Another reason why we shouldn't read this overly literally. You've probably read some books or maybe even seen some movies where they try to give a literal depiction of some of the things described here. Things like the stars of the sky falling to the earth. And so they might put, asteroids and meteorites and things. As the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale, the sky vanishing like a scroll that is rolled up, mountains and islands being removed. So they may depict these massive sort of world-changing earthquakes and, volcanoes and all sorts of things. Mm-hmm.
It seems like every generation is looking at this and trying to figure out what's going on in their generation.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is it's not a generational thing.
The first 4 seals are describing things that happen throughout every age. This 6th seal is describing something that is actually future, the final judgment. Yeah. But what I'm saying is the imagery that's used here shouldn't be taken overly literally, because John is using the language of the Old Testament to describe the final judgment. It's probably an indescribable thing. So what do you do when you try to describe something you saw that you can't describe? You turn to the Old Testament and you find language that might help you. One of the things you'll notice throughout the Old Testament is that many times when God wins a victory on behalf of his people, regardless of how he won that victory, when it's celebrated in poetry, now not when it's described in just telling a story, But when it's celebrated in poetry, you get this kind of language, like the sky falling, or changing colors, or mountains being removed, and things like that. You'll see that even in David's own descriptions, his poetic descriptions of battles that he won. And we know that, yes, God granted him the victory and God judged his enemies. But how did he do it? Well, through the normal means of warfare. When David marched out with an army and they defeated these people. But when David describes it poetically, he describes it in very similar language as this. So my point is that this kind of language is just meant to communicate to us that God is winning a final, ultimate victory over everything and everyone. The kings of the earth, slave and free, he's bringing everyone to account at his final judgment. That's what he's doing. I'll give you one example where we see some similar language. In Isaiah chapter 34, I'll turn there so you don't have to. In Isaiah chapter 34, we read about God's judgment upon the nations because they've participated in harming Israel, which, by the way, was also part of God's plan, but nevertheless. Here's what we read. I'll just pick up in verse 2. The Lord is enraged against all the nations and furious against all their host. He has devoted them to destruction. He has given them over for slaughter. Their slain shall be cast out, and the stench of their corpses shall rise. The mountains shall flow with their blood. All the host of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll. That sounds really familiar, right? All their hosts shall fall as leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree. For my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. Behold, it descends for judgment upon Edom. That's the next door neighbor of Israel. Upon the people I have devoted to destruction. I don't know if you remember the story very well, but when Israel was attacked by Assyria and later by Babylon, in both instances, Edom, their rivals right next door, aided their enemies, helped the enemies attack Israel. So this is God sort of responding and saying, Edom's going to get theirs for participating in attacking my people. Well, at that time, when he brings judgment upon Edom, you're not literally going to see the sky rolled up like a scroll, right? That's not what's happening. This is poetic language to help us understand how serious God is about his judgment. Esau's descendants, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. That's a narrative. That's just a straight story. So I think that's just telling us what happened. Right? So fire and sulfur rained down upon them. How that happened, we don't know. Maybe it was just miraculous. Maybe it was some kind of natural phenomenon that God used. I tend to think it was just miraculous. That's easier explanation for me. But that's in a narrative story, and I think that's what happened. Yeah. What would Edom be today? I mean, there are people that still trace their lineage back to the Edomites. They would be mostly, at this point in time, most of them are Bedouins who move from place to place, but you would find them typically in the sort of desert wilderness areas in southern Palestine. So, yeah. I mean, it was, but now they're more, those who trace their lineage back there, many of them are very nomadic now. But it's still in that same general region where Edom would have been in biblical days. But they don't stay in that one. They're not a recognizable nation of people. They're just kind of nomads a bit, yeah. So what we're getting here in the seals, in this sixth seal, is we're getting John's description, poetic description of the final judgment. What will it really look like? Literally, I don't know. But it's going to be bad news for God's enemies. They would rather have the mountains fall on top of them than face the wrath of the Lamb. And that phrase, the wrath of the Lamb, is one you need to remember. Because we need to understand that Jesus is not meek and mild. Jesus is humble in his earthly life, but there is coming a time when he himself will come in wrath to judge the world. It's not that we have merciful Jesus and a wrathful Father that he appeases on occasion. No. The Lamb himself will come in wrath. And it's not an accident that John sticks with the language of lamb. He could have said the wrath of the Lion of Judah. That would make more sense to us. But he wants us to remember the one who comes in wrath is the one who laid down his life and was raised. It's the very same one. So we have the first 4 seals grouped together, which I think describe temporal, that is, judgments in this, throughout this age, in this time, that come upon the wicked. Famines, wars, those types of things, various things. And then we're given a peek into the prayers of the martyrs. And then in the 6th seal, we're given some imagery that helps us to understand this future final judgment. Now, what comes after that is, again, this major parenthesis, which is all of chapter 7, where you get the description of the 144,000, the 12,000 from each tribe, if you are familiar with it. You have the multitude that no one can number. We're going to spend all of next Wednesday night on that, on chapter 7, because there's too much in there for me to unpack that and these 7 seals in one night. And there's some really important things in chapter 7 that I want us to just spend some time thinking about and think about maybe some of the implications of them. But we're left off without the last seal yet, right? I forgot to keep up. This is what we're skipping, the interlude or the parenthesis. We're coming back to it. But the 7th seal is here. Mm-hmm. Did I? Oh, yeah. Well, he essentially tells them that it's in the future. Hang on. There is a greater judgment coming, that the judgments described are not, that's not the full deal. Something greater, yeah. And he gives them white robes, probably to symbolize the fact that they have been forgiven, right? That they are pure in his sight. He gives them, let's see, where are they? The white robe, and they're told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete. So there are more martyrs to come. So that is an interesting thing to point out, is that even in the midst of these reassurances that God right now is not just letting the wicked run free, and that in the future there's a coming judgment, but even in the midst of that, he reminds us there will be more martyrs. We are never promised that we will escape all of that. So where's the 7th seal? Well, it's in chapter 8. And it has caused a great deal of confusion, but it's also recently been made into a really great joke on the internet. I don't know if you guys might be familiar with it. Let's read it first, okay? Chapter 8, verse 1. When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. That's it. That's the whole seal, okay? Has anybody seen the little videos or memes or whatever? You guys familiar with them? Where the joke? The joke or the video that's kind of, there's a bunch of different versions of it. That how do you know that there won't be any women for the first half hour in heaven because of it's a terrible joke. I don't endorse it. But this is where it comes from. If you want to know where they're getting it from here. But the question actually really is, what is the silence? That's where the debate is, okay? Some will say that the silence is just people standing in awe as they look upon the new heavens and new earth. Others, looking to the Old Testament and noting that there are a number of judgment passages that contain a mention of silence on behalf of those who are judged. Others would say that the seventh seal is the conclusion of the final judgment begun in the sixth seal. We got a break from it, we come back to it, and it's the conclusion of the final judgment. There are passages in the Old Testament that associate silence with judgment. I'll give you a couple of them. Jeremiah 7:34. Let's see here. Jeremiah 7:34. I'll read it for you. Where God says, I will silence in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land shall become a waste. This is one of God's pronouncing judgment upon the nation of Judah, and he describes that in terms of pronouncing silence, taking away all the sounds of happiness, of mirth, all those sorts of things. So we do have silence associated here and there with judgment. Habakkuk chapter 2, that's the wrong one. I'm going to come to that in a second. Amos chapter 8, 2 and 3. The Lord said to me, the end has come upon my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. The songs of the temple shall become wailings in that day, declares the Lord God. So many dead bodies, they are thrown everywhere. Silence. That's the final word. So, and there are other places as well, but silence in the Old Testament is sometimes closely associated with God's judgment. But silence is also associated with awe in God's presence. That's where the Habakkuk passage comes in that I almost read too early. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 20. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think that it is in the wake of God's judgment, having seen this depiction of God's judgment at the end of chapter 6, we had that break, we're coming back to it now. But also as we stand kind of on the edge and look toward the future that God is going to usher in after the final judgment, all of heaven is silent. I think it's a response to both. One of the really interesting things as we work our way through Revelation, each description of the judgment, the final judgment, is going to become more and more graphic. But what we're going to get when it comes to the new heavens and new earth are not detailed descriptions at all. In fact, sometimes no description. Just something like silence. Something great is coming. Until we get to the very end of Revelation. It's almost as if John is holding out, telling us what the new heavens and new earth are going to be like. Did he get glimpses earlier in his visions? We don't know. But he doesn't give us any details about what comes after the judgment until the end of the book. But we're going to see the judgment over and over again. So the seventh seal, the silence in heaven, I think is both a response to God's final judgment, but also kind of bated breath as we almost turn and look at what comes next. But not quite, because all of a sudden, in the very next verse, you shift to a new part of the book. So it just cuts off there. You get nothing except silence. And we move in to more visions. Any comments or questions over these seven seals or the four horsemen? Yes, ma'am. To where? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. You're on my right side. I can't hear out of that ear, so I have to walk over there. Go back. Right, yeah. For me, it's true. Allie and I switched sides of the bed because for years she was on the right side and I couldn't hear anything she's talking about at night. I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. Now I can hear her just fine. She's on the left side. Okay, there it is. Can you see it? Okay. That's really true, though. One night I was like, look, I honestly don't know what you're saying. I'm just pretending that I know. I have no idea. Let's just switch. And we did. It's fine now. Now I can hear. But in the car, if I'm driving, she's on the right side. I hear sounds, but I don't know what it is. Yeah. Any other questions about Revelation? Yeah.
Basically, what maybe I'm misunderstanding is that you're saying that some cyclical for the seals, the first through the sixth or fifth, rather.
Yeah.
Then the sixth.
The first four, I think, are different ways of describing God holding in check or bringing temporal judgments on people during this age. So I don't view the four horsemen as something happening in the future, but I think it's just God's summoning of judgment periodically now in this age. Yeah. Not the final judgment, but just to know that he's not ignoring things up until then. But there's not a full satisfaction of that cry of the martyrs until the final judgment. He's not ignoring everything. Yeah.
But when the martyrs are crying out, is it over the cyclical or is it over?
The scene shifts. You move from the horsemen upon the earth and you shift back to heaven. So the scene kind of shifts a little bit. You start off in heaven and then you're watching these horsemen on the earth, and then it suddenly shifts back to the souls of these martyrs in heaven. So there's a scene change.
So when he says there could be more world events in the future.
Oh yeah. What he tells them is, it is coming, and he'll describe it in the very next seal. But that seal hasn't been opened yet when they're crying out. It is coming, but it's not. The final judgment is not there yet. There's more suffering ahead for God's people before that happens. So, yes, ma'am.
Why is it that there's a lot of sermons out there that are on this, and it's saying that these are not like us? As in, like, they're different saints. Like, we've already.
Yeah, that's from the dispensational perspective, which believes that most of them will teach that from chapter 6 on, sometimes from chapter 4 on, but from chapter 6 on, that's all a depiction of just the very end of history. And they believe that before any of that happens, the church is taken out of the world in the rapture. So
So then would the Jews be taking in all this then? Like the church? Because I've heard that too, where it's like the Jews are still here, but the church is not.
no, there's no indication in the Bible that the church will be taken out of the world prior to Christ's return. And really what we're seeing is that the book of Revelation is not just describing the very end. It's describing the whole church age leading up to that end. So what we keep getting is, when we hit a new major section of the book of Revelation, each section ends with the judgment, final judgment. And it's almost like we hit the rewind button. Let's go back and let's watch the whole thing again, but now the movie is made with different actors by a different director, and so all the imagery changes and shifts. But it's the same story told again, but each time we get different imagery, we learn something else about God's nature, about what he requires of us, and about what's going to unfold throughout the church age and at the final judgment. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I know you're familiar with the Left Behind series.
Yeah.
So, does that line up more with Scripture as far as, because the way he depicts that story is that we leave and then they go through whatever they go through.
Yeah.
Tribulation time.
Yeah, I don't think that's what the New Testament teaches. I don't think that the scriptures teach us that the church or all Christians will be taken out of the world and then all these things are going to happen. I think that Christians will be present and will be here all the way up until the final judgment and the return of Christ. And I don't think the book of Revelation is describing just the last few years before Jesus returns. I think the book of Revelation does describe the end, certainly, several times, many times. But it's also helping us to see what life is going to continue to be like in this world and in this age.
So what is a 1,000-year reign with peace and all that?
We'll get to that. That is probably the most debated, contentious issue in the whole book, and we'll get to it. Well, there's a first resurrection and a second resurrection. And so I think my interpretation is that the first resurrection refers to the new birth, where we are, in Ephesians 2, we are raised up with Christ. So it's the new birth, and the second resurrection is our physical resurrection at the end. That's how I interpret it. But we'll get there, and we'll see some different interpretations, some different views on the 1,000 years and strengths and weaknesses of them a little bit. And then I'll make a case for what I think is the best interpretation. But it's one of those things where you have to go, well, sometimes we're just going to disagree on stuff. That's okay. Yeah. All right. Yes. I'm making it as I go. So, yes. When I'm done, it'll all be available. Yeah. But I'm just making them each week as I go. Okay? 7:39. I'll bet over there in the children's room they want to know what we're doing. So let me pray. God, I thank you that in your wisdom you chose to reveal these things to John, and that he wrote them down for us. And while there are many things that are difficult to understand in the book of Revelation, we do see clearly depicted for us your righteousness and your commitment to setting all things right in the end. And I pray that we would take to heart that reality, so that no matter what we face in this world, we will trust that you are still working, and that someday you will judge the world and make all things right. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah, Colt, every week I just add on to it's so